The charge for driving in the ultra-low emissions zone recently introduced in outer London is a really divisive issue. Some issues just become so controversial that it seems like there's no room for any debate about the issue. ULEZ definitely seems to be falling into that category. Now, I hardly ever drive into London, and although I have an old car, it actually is ULEZ compliant, so I'll never have to pay this charge. I say this because I understand that people who are suddenly being required to pay £12.50 every day to drive to work, that is bound to colour your perspective on it. It must be so frustrating for people who are in this position. But let's put that to one side for a minute and look at the economic case for the ULEZ charge. The economics of this are very clear. Economists talk about externalities when there's costs or benefits associated with an economic transaction that are not directly related to the transaction. In the case of the environment, the global economy has operated on the basis that most economic transactions did not incorporate the costs of damage to the environment into the price. The market fails to take this into account, and of course we call this market failure. Along with all major economies, the UK has policies that attempt to correct this market failure. For example, the UK has an emissions trading scheme that provides a price for carbon emissions. An industry that wants to pollute more has to pay for this. This is critical in terms of reaching the net zero goal. ULEZ is a policy that definitely has a similar economic justification. Let's just consider some of the facts on air pollution. The government says that air pollution is a major public health risk, ranking alongside cancer, heart disease and obesity. It shortens lives and damages quality of life for many people. This is absolutely unambiguous, and I don't see how we can ever ignore this. The government's own estimate on the cost to the NHS of air pollution are clear. The total NHS cost due to particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide in England in 2017 were £43 million. This was where a robust correlation existed between the substances and the health problems. In the case of some health problems, it's not possible to be 100% certain what the precise cause of the problem is. Taking into account cases where these pollutants may have been the cause, but where it can't be definitively established, the cost was estimated at £157 million. Of course, these are only the healthcare costs of air pollution. If you were to calculate the true cost of air pollution, the disruptive effect on the lives of ordinary people would have to be taken into account, and this includes death in some cases. The cost of motoring does not include these costs, and most economists would agree that there's a clear role for government in stepping in to correct that market failure. The government stats show that 35% of nitrogen dioxide emissions and 12% of particulate emissions come from road transport. So there's no doubt that there will be a significant health benefit from the new Outer London ULEZ charge. The evidence from the use of such charges in Inner London and in other cities confirms this. So in principle, a charging scheme such as ULEZ is a very good idea from an economic perspective. The charge increases the cost of polluting and creates a financial incentive for road users to move to less polluting alternatives. However, there are some complexities here. The first one relates to the fact that some road users really object to such policies, particularly in a cost of living crisis. The realities of climate change mean that we're all going to have to drastically change the way we live. Change is difficult and there is going to be pain along the way. This ULEZ pain is an example of how real it gets when policies that deal with our environmental problems actually kick in. However, I don't believe that there is an entitlement to pollute, at least without paying the appropriate cost. Of course, we live in a democracy and it is possible that more negative attitudes to progressive environmental policies may become a big issue in the next UK election. The politics are complex, but from an economic perspective, the rationale for cost-increasing environmental measures is robust. The second complexity is that I'm not 100% certain whether the 1250 ULEZ charge is the right specific policy. It does target a relatively small group of people who are probably going to be on lower incomes. And there was a time, of course, when people were encouraged to buy diesel cars, precisely the cars that are now being subjected to this charge. So you can certainly understand why this measure feels unfair to those that have to pay it. Given this, would there have been a better way of doing it? To be honest, I don't know enough of the detailed specifics of this issue to express an opinion. However, what I can say is that this does seem to be a bit of a blunt measure. I mentioned earlier the emissions trading scheme. In that case, the more that a company pollutes, the more the company has to pay. In this case, the person that drives a relatively short journey to work pays the same as the person who drives around all day in their car. In the context of electric vehicles, there has been some discussion about a congestion charge that would be paid per mile. The technology will allow for this possibility, but I don't think that this is possible in the case of the ULEZ charge for diesel cars. A flat rate is possibly the only option. In this case, it's absolutely right that grants are available to those affected to help them in switching to a less polluting car. If the £2,000 on offer isn't enough, which some are claiming, perhaps those on the lowest incomes could be offered more. Another question that I think needs to be raised is why this is left to local authorities. Low emission zones are being introduced by local authorities in a number of other UK cities. Wouldn't it make sense for an overall scheme to be coordinated by the government? This might allow for a more generous scrappage subsidy if the costs are more spread across the whole country. Another point to make is that local authorities and government must be doing everything they can to improve the alternatives, rail, bus, cycle lanes. As with many areas of public policy, we need a big increase in government spending so that there are viable travel alternatives. I think all motorists need to be encouraged to switch transport methods, and the alternatives need to be dramatically improved for this to happen. I think there's also a question around the other causes of air pollution. We know from those government stats I quoted earlier that 65% of nitrogen dioxide emissions and 88% of particulate emissions do not come from road transport. Are there schemes being put in place to deal with these other causes? If so, this needs to be made clear so that it doesn't look like this relatively small group of motorists is being particularly targeted. One final point. One of the big criticisms that we're hearing of ULEZ is that it really hits the poor. I think we might question why people have suddenly become so concerned about the poor on this issue. We have massive poverty and inequality issues in this country, and it doesn't seem as if people are making as much noise about that. Also, the poorest people don't have cars. They use public transport, and there is evidence that the poor are the most affected by air pollution health problems. An interesting footnote. Overall, I think the economics of this ULEZ scheme are clear. I think there are questions about whether the scrappage scheme could be more generous, but in the end, I do think this type of policy is absolutely needed. We're living in a climate crisis, and we need to dramatically change the way that we live. There'll be a lot more of the type of pain that this ULEZ scheme is causing. I hope you found this information useful. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching. See you next time.